Story number 1. The final call. I was halfway through my shift when the call came in. A cold December night in Detroit, the kind where the wind cuts through your uniform no matter how many layers you've got on. The streets were mostly quiet, the city huddled under a blanket of frost, and I was counting the hours until I could head home, crack a beer, and forget about the world for a while. Dispatch buzzed in over the radio, her voice unusually tense. Unit 6 to 4, we've got a 911 call reporting a disturbance at the old 7th Precinct. Can you check it out? I frowned. The 7th Precinct hadn't been operational in over 20 years. It was a crumbling relic on the outskirts of the city, a place no one went unless they had a death wish or a camera and a taste for urban decay. You sure about that, Angie? I asked, picking up the radio. 7TH has been out of commission for decades. Call came in from the landline inside the station, she said, her voice taut. We tried to trace it, but it cut off. Thought it might be squatters or someone messing around. I sighed, pulling the patrol car onto the nearest exit ramp. All right. I'm on it. The drive out to the old precinct was uneventful, but the unease started to creep in as soon as the building came into view. The 7th Precinct was a hulking, brick monolith, its windows shattered and its walls streaked with graffiti. The place had been abandoned for as long as I'd been on the force, left to rot after the city decided it wasn't worth the money to keep it running. But tonight, the lights were on. A faint, flickering glow spilled out from the broken windows, cutting through the fog that had rolled in off the river. I pulled the car to a stop out front, killing the engine but leaving the headlights on. The radio crackled softly, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. Grabbing my flashlight and sidearm, I stepped out into the cold. My boots crunched against the frost-coated pavement as I approached the building, the beam of my light sweeping across the graffiti-scrawled doors. They were slightly ajar, a thin line of light spilling out into the night. Hello? I called, my voice echoing off the walls. Detroit PD. If anyone's in there, make yourself known. Silence. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The lobby was just as I remembered it from the old photos, high ceilings, a cracked tile floor, and a long desk that had once been the hub of activity. Now it was covered in dust and debris, the remnants of years of neglect. But the lights were on. Fluorescent tubes buzzed and flickered overhead, casting a sickly glow over the room. Papers were scattered across the desk, files that looked far too pristine to have been sitting here for 20 years. I moved closer, my flashlight illuminating the nearest folder. It was a case file. The name on the tab was familiar, too familiar. It belonged to a missing persons case I'd worked on 2 years ago. A young woman who'd vanished without a trace, her car found abandoned in a parking lot. The file was open, pages neatly arranged, the details of the case laid out like I'd just written them. But the ending was different. Case closed. Body recovered. Cause of death, strangulation. I froze. That wasn't right. We never found her. The case was still open, still haunting me like so many others. My heart thudded in my chest as I flipped through the papers, every detail painfully accurate except for the ending. The sound of a phone ringing broke the silence, sharp and jarring. I turned, my flashlight beam slicing through the dark to the far end of the room. There, on the wall, was an old rotary phone, its black receiver vibrating against the cradle. It shouldn't have been working. The power in this place shouldn't have been working. But the phone rang on, insistent. I crossed the room slowly, my every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. Picking up the receiver, I pressed it to my ear. Hello? There was a crackle of static, then a voice. Low, distorted, and somehow familiar. You shouldn't have come here. My blood ran cold. Who is this? No answer. Just the sound of breathing, heavy and slow. Then the line went dead. I replaced the receiver, my hand trembling. Turning back to the desk, I noticed something I hadn't before, a second file, sitting apart from the others. My name was on the tab. Swallowing hard, I opened it. The first page was my personnel record, every detail of my career laid out in crisp, typewritten text. The next page was worse. It was a report, written in my own handwriting, detailing my death. Cause of death, gunshot wound. Date, today. The room seemed to tilt around me, the air growing colder. My flashlight flickered, and the buzzing of the lights overhead grew louder, almost deafening. And then I saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of the room, tall and thin, its edges rippling like smoke. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. I raised my gun, the weight of it somehow less reassuring than it should have been. The shadow moved closer, resolving into a figure. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. The face was the same, but the eyes were empty, hollow sockets that seemed to pull the light from the room. It raised a hand, pointing directly at me. "You can't escape," it said, its voice layered with a dozen others. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The papers on the desk fluttered, lifted by a wind that shouldn't have been there. The lights flickered wildly, plunging the room into intermittent darkness. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the precinct, but the next thing I knew, I was in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from that cursed place. The radio crackled again, Angie's voice cutting through the static. 6-4, do you copy? What's your status? I grabbed the mic, my hand shaking. I'm fine, I lied. Nothing to report. I didn't tell her about the files, the phone call, or the shadow. I didn't tell anyone. But as I write this, I know the truth. The date on that file was today, and the sun is setting. The shadows are getting longer, and I think I hear the phone ringing again. Story number 2. The Nameless Prisoner. It was supposed to be a quiet shift at the Phoenix precinct. Winter nights in the desert don't offer much excitement, just the occasional bar fight or domestic dispute. I liked it that way. After nearly 2 decades on the force, I'd seen enough chaos to appreciate the quiet nights, the ones where the clock ticked slower, and the worst you had to deal with was paperwork. That's why the call about the man in the desert caught my attention. A local deputy had picked him up wandering the outskirts of the city, close to one of those endless stretches of sand and scrub that seemed to lead nowhere. It wasn't the location that was strange, it was the man himself. "He's off," the deputy told me when he dropped him off at the station. No ID, no wallet, nothing. His prints don't match any database. It's like he doesn't exist. The man didn't resist as we led him into the station, his hands cuffed loosely in front of him. He was tall and thin, with pale skin that looked almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights. His hair was white, though he didn't look older than 40, and his eyes, there was something about his eyes. They were a light, almost colorless gray, and they seemed to look right through you. I was the one who booked him. Standard procedure. Name, age, address. He gave no answers, just sat there with a faint, unreadable smile. When I asked him directly, his first words chilled me to the bone. "I'm here to warn you." His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Warn me about what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. He didn't respond, just stared at me with those strange, pale eyes. We put him in an interrogation room, the kind with the one-way mirror and a single overhead light. I watched from the observation window as Detective Morales went in to question him. She's one of the best, sharp and no nonsense, but even she seemed unsettled as she sat across from him. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice clipped. The man tilted his head, his smile widening. "Names don't matter." "Not anymore." "Where are you from?" "Farther than you'd believe." "Why were you wandering in the desert?" His smile faded, and for the first time, something like sadness flickered in his eyes. "I came to warn you." "What kind of warning?" Morales asked, leaning forward. The man opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, the lights in the room flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then the whispers began. They came from the corners of the room, soft and indistinct, like a dozen voices murmuring at once. The sound crackled through the speakers in the observation room, and I felt my stomach twist. It wasn't static. It wasn't feedback. It was something else. Morales' voice broke through the whispers, sharp and panicked. What the hell is this? The lights flickered back on, and the room was silent again. The man hadn't moved. He was sitting exactly as he had been, his hands folded neatly on the table, his smile back in place. That's your warning, he said softly. Morales stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She was pale, her hands shaking as she lit a cigarette in the observation hallway. He's messing with us, she said, her voice tight. Some kind of trick. But I wasn't so sure. We played back the recording from the interrogation, hoping to catch something that would explain what had happened. The whispers were there, faint but clear, words overlapping and tangled. One phrase stood out, repeated again and again, growing louder with each iteration. You can't stop it. That night, Morales didn't go home. She stayed late at the station, poring over the file we'd started on the man. Around midnight, she called me into the break room. You need to see this, she said, her voice flat. She'd been looking into unsolved cases from the area, hoping to find some connection to our mystery man. She'd found something, too much, actually. Dozens of cases over the past 50 years, all tied to the same location where the man had been found. People disappearing, their bodies never recovered. Reports of strange lights, inexplicable noises, and shadowy figures moving through the desert at night. And then there was the photo. It was grainy, black and white, and taken decades ago. It showed a group of deputies standing in the desert, their faces lit by a camera flash. Behind them, partially obscured by shadow, was a man. He was tall and thin, with pale skin and light hair. It was him. That's impossible, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Before Morales could respond, the lights in the station flickered, and the air seemed to grow heavier. The radio at my desk crackled to life, a burst of static that resolved into a voice, low, distorted, and chillingly familiar. You can't stop it. We both froze, staring at the radio as the voice repeated the phrase again and again, growing louder each time. The room seemed to vibrate with the sound, the walls closing in around us. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. When we ran back to the interrogation room, the man was gone. The cuffs were still on the table, open, as if he'd simply slipped out of them. The door was locked, the window unbroken. There was no way he could have left. That was a week ago. Morales is dead now. She didn't show up for her shift 2 days later, and when they went to check her apartment, they found her in the bathroom. No signs of a struggle. No cause of death. Just her body, pale and cold, her eyes wide with terror. I don't know what's coming, but I can feel it. At night, I hear the whispers through the walls of my house, growing louder with each passing day. I see his face in the shadows, his pale eyes staring back at me. He came to warn us, but he didn't say what about. And now, I think it's too late. Story number 3. Shadows in the Precinct. The 14th Precinct in Chicago wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of place you'd see in TV shows or movies, with shiny desks and sharp-dressed detectives. It was old, creaky, and smelled faintly of burnt coffee and damp paper. But it was ours, a second home to the men and women who worked there, pulling long shifts and trying to keep the chaos of the city from spilling over. Until Officer Daniels died. Daniels had been with the precinct for nearly a decade. He was a steady presence, the kind of guy you could count on to cover your shift or buy you a beer after a bad day. His death hit everyone hard, not just because of how it happened, but because of where. People get killed every day in Chicago, but not here. Not in the station. And not like that. I was on duty the night it happened, working the late shift with a skeleton crew. Daniels was at his desk, finishing up some paperwork from an earlier arrest. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you glance over your shoulder for no reason. The overhead lights hummed, the radiator clanged, and the clock ticked its way toward midnight. Then we heard the scream. It echoed through the station, sharp and guttural, the kind of sound that makes your blood run cold. I jumped out of my chair, my heart hammering in my chest, and ran toward the noise. It was coming from the bullpen, where Daniels had been working. I wasn't the first one there. Detective Hughes was already in the room, standing frozen in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something I'd never seen before, fear. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. I stepped past him, and my stomach turned. Daniels was slumped over his desk, blood pooling beneath him and dripping onto the floor. His throat had been slashed so deeply it was a wonder his head was still attached. Papers and pens were scattered across the desk, as if he'd struggled. But there was no one else in the room. We searched the station from top to bottom, every hallway, every office, every closet. Nothing. The front door was locked, the back exit bolted shut. No one had come in or out. It didn't make sense. Then we checked the security footage. The camera above Danielle's desk showed him working, the glow of his computer monitor casting shadows across his face. For a while, everything seemed normal. Then he looked up, his expression shifting from confusion to fear. He was talking, but there was no one there. Just him, gesturing and shaking his head like he was arguing with someone we couldn't see. Then it happened. He jerked backward, his chair skidding across the floor. His hands went to his throat, blood spraying as if an invisible blade had sliced him open. He thrashed for a moment before collapsing onto the desk, his lifeless eyes staring at the camera. We watched the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it. There was no attacker, no weapon, nothing but Daniels and the terrible violence that claimed his life. The longer we watched, the less it felt like we were looking at evidence and more like we were staring into something we weren't meant to see. The whispers started that same night. At first, it was just Hughes who heard them. He was sitting at Danielle's desk, sorting through his papers, when he looked up, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" I asked, glancing around. Someone said my name. I didn't hear anything, but Hughes swore he did. He brushed it off as stress, muttering about needing sleep, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. Over the next few days, more of us started hearing things. Footsteps echoing down empty hallways. Doors creaking open when no one was there. And the whispers, soft, indistinct, but always close, like someone was standing just behind you. And then we started seeing him. It was Hughes again who saw him first. He was working late, the station mostly empty, when he looked up and saw Daniel standing at the end of the hallway. "I thought it was someone messing with me," Hughes said the next morning, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. But it was him. I swear to God, it was him. He just stood there, staring at me. I wanted to believe he was imagining it, that grief and exhaustion were playing tricks on his mind. But then Lisa, one of the rookies, saw him too. And then I did. It was late, past midnight, and I was finishing up a report when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Daniel standing in the doorway. His uniform was pristine, no sign of the blood or violence that had taken his life. But his face was wrong. His eyes were blank, hollow, and his mouth was twisted into something between a snarl and a grin. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching me. "Daniels?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He tilted his head, the movement slow and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Then he vanished. After that, it got worse. The whispers grew louder, the footsteps more frequent. Lights flickered, radios crackled with static, and the temperature in the station seemed to drop by the hour. And Daniels, he was everywhere. Standing in the bullpen, sitting at his old desk, watching from the corners of the room. We tried to ignore it, to keep working like everything was normal, but it wasn't. People started calling in sick, quitting outright. Hughes stopped coming in altogether. When I went to check on him, I found his apartment empty, the door wide open and his badge lying on the floor. I don't know what's happening here, but I know it's not over. Daniels isn't just haunting the station, he's stuck here, trapped in whatever nightmare took him that night. And now, it feels like he's pulling us in too. The whispers are louder now, almost constant, and the shadows seem to move even when there's no one around. Last night, I found a message scrawled across the whiteboard in the bullpen, written in blood. "You're next." I don't know how much longer I can stay here. But I don't think leaving will matter. Whatever's in this station, it's not just in the walls. It's in us. It's in me. And I don't think it's going to let us go. Story number 4. The Endless Road. Clinton Road wasn't just another stretch of asphalt. Everyone in the department knew it had a reputation, whispers of strange lights, ghostly figures, and the kind of stories that get passed around precincts to freak out rookies. But I wasn't a rookie. I'd been on the force for 15 years, patrolling the back roads of New Jersey, and I didn't buy into ghost stories. That's why, when the sergeant asked for a volunteer to check out a call about strange activity on Clinton Road, I raised my hand. It's probably kids screwing around, I said, trying to brush off the nervous looks my colleagues exchanged. Someone's got to do it. The road was 10 miles of winding pavement cutting through dense woods, with no streetlights, no houses, and no cell service. It was the kind of place you avoided if you could, especially after dark. And it was dark, clouds hung low in the sky, blocking out the moon and stars, leaving only my headlights to cut through the gloom. The first few miles were uneventful, the only sounds the hum of my engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. The trees loomed over the road like skeletal hands, their bare branches swaying in the cold wind. It was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making your ears strained for the slightest sound. I told myself the stories were just that, stories. The ghost truck that chases drivers, the haunted bridge, the phantom hitchhikers. Urban legends meant to scare teenagers. But as I drove deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I saw him. A boy, maybe 10 or 11, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. My heart pounded as the car skidded to a stop just a few feet from him. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I got out of the car, the cold air biting at my face. "Hey, kid," I called, keeping my voice calm. "Are you okay? What are you doing out here?" He didn't answer. His clothes were old-fashioned, too old-fashioned. A threadbare jacket, scuffed shoes, and pants that looked like they belonged in a black and white photo. His face was pale, almost gray, and his dark hair hung limp across his forehead. "You lost?" I asked, taking a cautious step toward him. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Do you need help?" I tried again, my voice firmer this time. The boy nodded, then pointed to the passenger seat of my cruiser. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn around, get back in the car, and drive away. But I couldn't just leave him there. He was a kid, for God's sake. "All right," I said, opening the passenger door. "Get in. We'll figure this out." He climbed into the car without a word, his movements slow and deliberate. I got back behind the wheel, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded neatly in his lap, staring straight ahead. "What's your name?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational. No answer. "Where do you live? Do you have family around here?" He turned to me, that strange smile still on his face. "Just drive." A knot tightened in my stomach, but I started the car and pulled back onto the road. The boy didn't say another word, just sat there, staring out the windshield as the trees blurred past. The air in the car felt heavy, like the heater wasn't working, and the headlights didn't seem to reach as far as they should. It was as if the darkness was pressing in, swallowing the light. We reached a curve in the road, and as I turned the wheel, the boy laughed, a low, chilling sound that didn't belong to a child. "What's so funny?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me, his smile widening. "You missed a turn." "What turn?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed ahead, where the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. My grip tightened on the wheel. "Kid, this isn't funny. Tell me where you need to go." But he just kept smiling, his eyes glinting in the dim light. The radio crackled, the static growing louder, and I realized something was wrong. The landmarks I'd passed earlier, the crooked sign, the old bridge, were gone. The road ahead was unfamiliar, the trees denser, the darkness deeper. "Where are we?" I demanded, my voice rising. "What's going on?" The boy didn't respond. He just pointed to the rearview mirror. I glanced up and froze. There was something behind the car, a shadowy figure running in the middle of the road, its limbs too long, its movements unnatural. It was gaining on us, its glowing eyes locked on mine through the mirror. "Hang on," I muttered, slamming my foot on the gas. The engine roared as the car sped up, but no matter how fast I drove, the figure stayed close, its twisted form illuminated by the taillights. "What is that?" I shouted, glancing at the boy. He didn't answer. He just laughed again, a sound that made my skin crawl. The road twisted and turned, the headlights barely cutting through the darkness. I felt like I was driving in circles, the same trees and curves repeating endlessly. My heart pounded as the shadow grew closer, its clawed hands reaching for the car. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was gone. The boy was gone too. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. The passenger seat was empty, the door closed, as if he'd never been there. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my hands gripping the wheel, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Eventually, I turned the car around and drove back to the precinct. The road was normal again, the landmarks where they should be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been somewhere else, somewhere I wasn't meant to be. I filed my report, leaving out the parts no one would believe. The sergeant didn't ask any questions, just nodded and told me to go home and get some rest. But I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. And I haven't driven Clinton Road since. They say the road has a way of pulling you in, of showing you things you can't unsee. I don't know what I saw that night, or where the boy came from. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I hear his laughter, faint and distant, like it's waiting for me to come back. Story number 5. The Haunted Blues. I transferred to the New Orleans Police Department at the start of November. Fresh start, new city. After 5 years on the force in Baton Rouge, I thought I'd seen it all: drugs, violence, heartbreak, and the occasional slice of hope. But New Orleans was something else entirely. The city had a pulse, a heartbeat that thumped beneath the cracked sidewalks and moss-draped oaks. It was alive, and not just with music and tourists. There was something darker, something that lingered in the narrow alleys and shadowy corners of the French Quarter. I didn't believe in ghosts when I first got here. But then, I hadn't met the uniform yet. It started on my second day. They didn't have a new set of blues ready for me, so I was sent to the storage room to dig through the archives. The room was musty and dimly lit, packed with boxes of old case files, evidence bags, and spare gear that smelled faintly of mildew and sweat. I found a rack of uniforms shoved into the back corner, some of them so old they looked like they belonged in a museum. "Take whatever fits," the quartermaster said with a shrug. "Budget's tight, you know." I picked out a shirt and pants that seemed close enough to my size. The fabric was stiff but serviceable, the brass buttons tarnished with age. The name patch had been removed, leaving behind faint stitching that spelled a name I couldn't quite make out. I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have. The first time it happened, I was on patrol in the French Quarter. The streets were quieter than usual, a rare lull between festivals, and the air smelled of damp stone and distant jazz. I was walking down a narrow alley, my boots echoing off the walls, when I felt it, a sudden jolt, like a static shock, but deeper, stronger. And then I wasn't in the alley anymore. I was running, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath ragged. It was night, but not the same night. The air was hotter, heavier, and the sound of my boots slapping the pavement was drowned out by shouting. Ahead of me, a figure darted around a corner, and I knew I had to catch him. My hand went to my sidearm, but it wasn't there. Panic rose in my throat. And then I was back. Standing in the alley, my hand gripping the wall for support, my head spinning. "Hey, you okay?" my partner, Officer Grayson, called from the other end of the block. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah. Just thought I saw something." He gave me a look but didn't press. I didn't tell him what I'd really seen, what I'd felt. How could I? It didn't make any sense. It happened again the next day. And the day after that. Each time, the visions grew longer, clearer. They weren't just flashes, they were memories. But they weren't mine. I was a different person in those moments. My name was Jack. I was a beat cop in the 1970s, chasing suspects through the same streets I patrolled now. I felt his adrenaline, his fear, his anger. I saw the world through his eyes, every detail sharp and vivid. And I saw how it ended. It was always the same, a chase through the alleys, a gunfight that left him bleeding out on the cobblestones, the sound of distant sirens fading as his vision blurred. The pain was real. The blood was real. I'd wake from the visions gasping for air, clutching my chest where the bullet had hit. By the end of the week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went back to the storage room, searching for answers, but all I found was more dust and darkness. The quartermaster didn't have much to say. "That uniform's been in storage for years," he said with a shrug. "Might have belonged to a guy named Jack Moreau. He was killed on duty back in '79. Damn shame." The name sent a chill down my spine. It matched the stitching on the uniform, the faint letters I'd barely noticed before. I started digging into Moreau's file, but it was thin. The records from that era weren't digitized, and the paper copies were faded and incomplete. The basics were there: his age, his time on the force, his death in the line of duty. But the details of the case were missing, as if someone had deliberately erased them. That's when I found the newspaper clipping. It was tucked into the bottom of the file, a yellowed article from 1979. The headline read, "Officer Killed in Mysterious Alley Shootout." The article described the incident in vague terms, but one line stood out: witnesses reported strange phenomena at the scene, including unexplainable lights and whispers. Whispers. I'd heard them too. Late at night, when the station was quiet and the city slept. Faint and indistinct, like a conversation just out of earshot. The visions grew stronger. They didn't just happen on patrol anymore, they came in my sleep, vivid nightmares that left me drenched in sweat. And it wasn't just Moreau's death I saw. I saw his life, his arguments with his wife, his struggles with the job, his growing paranoia as he felt something closing in on him. I started seeing him, too. At first, it was just glimpses, a shadow at the edge of my vision, a reflection in a window that didn't match my movements. But then, one night, I came face to face with him. I was patrolling near Bourbon Street, the streets empty except for the occasional drunk stumbling home. I rounded a corner, and there he was, standing in the middle of the alley. He wore the same uniform I did, his face pale and his eyes hollow. "You can't outrun it," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "Outrun what?" I demanded, my hand going to my sidearm. He didn't answer. He just smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and disappeared into the shadows. I tried to get rid of the uniform. I left it in the locker room, stuffed into a corner, but it always came back. I'd find it hanging neatly in my locker the next morning, pressed and clean, as if it had never been touched. The whispers followed me home, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just voices anymore, they were words. They spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of a darkness that couldn't be escaped. And then, one night, I woke to find the uniform draped over the chair in my bedroom. I don't know how much longer I can take this. Moreau's memories are bleeding into mine, his life mixing with mine until I can't tell where he ends and I begin. I see his death every time I close my eyes, feel the bullet tearing through me, hear the whispers calling my name. The city feels different now, darker and heavier, like it's closing in on me. The alleys seem narrower, the shadows deeper. And no matter where I go, I feel like I'm being watched. I think Moreau wants something from me. Maybe he wants justice. Maybe he wants me to finish what he couldn't. Or maybe he just wants me to understand what it feels like to die alone in the dark. Whatever it is, I don't think I can give it to him. But I know one thing for sure, the uniform isn't just a uniform. It's a doorway, a link to something I can't explain, something I can't escape. And I'm afraid it's going to take me, too. Story number 6. The Vanishing Woods. The call came in just before dawn, the kind of early morning alert that forces you out of bed when you've barely slept. A family of 4 had gone missing somewhere deep in Olympic National Park. They'd been camping for the weekend, their last known location somewhere along one of the park's lesser-used trails. When they didn't show up for work and school on Monday, a worried neighbor called it in. It sounded like a straightforward search and rescue operation, the kind of thing the park rangers usually handled. But this one was different. There were reports of strange noises in the area, odd tracks near the family's campsite. And then there was the fact that the family's last call to 911, cut short by static, ended with a single chilling word, help. By the time I arrived at the ranger station, the place was already buzzing. Officers, rangers, and a few volunteers were poring over maps and coordinating search teams. I was paired with Officer Mike Grayson, a seasoned cop who'd been patrolling the Olympic Peninsula for 20 years. Grayson was the kind of guy who never seemed rattled, no matter what he faced. But even he seemed uneasy as we prepared to head out. "They say the forest out here has a way of swallowing people," he said, checking his gear. "You ever hear of the Hoh River Phantom?" "Ghost stories," I replied, trying to sound confident. "We've got a job to do." We loaded up our truck and headed into the park, the sun just starting to peek over the treetops. The forest was dense, the kind of wild, untamed land where the trees seemed to stretch forever. The farther we drove, the less civilization there was, until the paved road gave way to gravel and finally to dirt. We found the family's car about 5 miles in, parked at the edge of a narrow trail. It was covered in frost, the windows fogged up from the cold. Inside were their belongings, backpacks, a half-eaten sandwich, a child stuffed animal. It was as if they just stepped out and vanished. Grayson crouched down near the car, his gloved hand brushing over the snow-covered ground. "Tracks," he said. "Looks like they headed into the woods." The tracks were fresh, leading away from the car and into the dense forest. But after about 50 yards, they changed. At first, it looked like the family had been walking side by side. Then the footprints grew erratic, like they'd been running. And then they stopped altogether, replaced by deep grooves in the snow, as if someone or something had dragged them away. "Jesus," I muttered, my breath fogging in the cold air. "What the hell happened here?" Grayson didn't answer. His face was pale, his eyes scanning the trees. "Let's keep moving," he said finally. "But stay close." We radioed back to the station, but all we got was static. Grayson frowned, adjusting the frequency, but the only sound that came through was a faint, whispering noise, like dozens of voices speaking at once. I reached for the radio, but he shook his head. "It's the mountains," he said. "Screws with the signal. We'll try again when we get to higher ground." We followed the grooves in the snow deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around us. The light grew dimmer, even though it was barely noon. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, and the air felt heavy, like we were being watched. The tracks led us to a small clearing, where we found the family's campsite, or what was left of it. The tent had been torn open, the fabric shredded and flapping in the wind. Their gear was scattered across the ground, and the snow was stained with something dark. Blood. Grayson knelt near the torn tent, his hand hovering over the ground. "There's no way this was an animal," he said. "The cuts are too clean." "Then what did this?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. As we searched the site, I noticed something strange. The snow around the campsite wasn't just disturbed, it was melting, as if the ground beneath it was radiating heat. Steam rose in faint tendrils, and the air smelled faintly of iron. "Mike," I said, pointing to the ground. "What is that?" Before he could respond, the whispering started again. At first, I thought it was the radio. But when I turned it off, the whispers didn't stop. They were coming from the trees, faint and indistinct, like voices just out of reach. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, desperate, pleading. "We need to go," Grayson said, his voice tight. "Now." We started back the way we came, but the forest seemed different. The trail we'd followed was gone, replaced by more trees, more snow, more shadows. The whispers grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were right behind us. Grayson stopped suddenly, his hand on his holster. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I followed his gaze and froze. Something was moving between the trees, tall, thin, and impossibly fast. It darted from shadow to shadow, always just out of sight, but close enough to feel its presence. My hand tightened on my flashlight, the beam trembling as I swept it across the forest. And then it stopped. In the distance, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It was too far to make out clearly, but its silhouette was human. It stood with its head tilted, as if watching us. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Grayson grabbed my arm. "Don't," he said. "Whatever it is, it's not friendly." We kept moving, faster now, the figure disappearing into the shadows. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. We emerged into another clearing, breathless and panicked. But this one was different. In the center of the clearing was a single tree, its bark blackened and twisted, its branches bare. Hanging from one of the branches was something that made my blood run cold, a child stuffed animal, swinging gently in the breeze. Grayson cursed under his breath. "They're playing with us." "Who?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Who's doing this?" Before he could answer, the ground beneath us shifted. The snow gave way, and I fell hard, landing on something cold and unyielding. I looked down and realized with horror that it wasn't snow I'd fallen onto, it was bone. A mass grave, hidden beneath the snow, the skeletons tangled together in a silent scream. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the shadows began to move again. Grayson pulled me to my feet, his face pale with terror. "Run," he said. We ran. I don't remember how we made it out of the forest. The shadows followed us the whole way, and the whispers didn't stop until we reached the edge of the trees. When we finally stumbled back to the ranger station, exhausted and terrified, no one believed us. The family was never found. And I can't stop dreaming about that clearing, the tree, and the whispers that seemed to linger in the back of my mind. I haven't been back to the park since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the voices again. And I know they're still waiting. Story number 7. The Sealed Station. When I first started at the Salem Police Department, I thought I'd landed a routine gig. Sure, Salem had its history, the witch trials, the folklore, the tourism, but in the modern world, it was just another town with its share of petty crimes and domestic disputes. Or so I thought. The station was a squat, brick building on the edge of downtown, unremarkable except for the plaque near the front door, built 1898, site of Salem's 17th century jail. It was something the city leaned into for the tourist crowd, a nod to the past, a wink to the ghost stories that kept visitors coming. But to those of us working there, it was a footnote, little more than trivia. At first, the strange occurrences were easy to dismiss. Cold drafts seemed normal in a building this old, and flickering lights could be chalked up to faulty wiring. But it wasn't long before the stories began to pile up. Officers reported hearing footsteps echoing in empty hallways, their calls going unanswered until they realized they were the only ones in the building. Late at night, some swore they heard faint whispers, indistinct but persistent. The first big incident came when Officer Peterson claimed he saw a woman in the bullpen. It was well past midnight, and he was alone, writing up reports, when he felt a chill sweep over him. When he turned around, there she was. She was pale, with deep-set eyes and dressed in clothes that looked like something out of a history book, a dark, tattered dress and a bonnet tied under her chin. Peterson said she didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there in the corner of the room, staring at him with this piercing intensity. He blinked, and she was gone. Word spread fast. At first, most of us dismissed it. Long hours and too much coffee could make anyone see things. But when others started reporting similar sightings, a woman in old-fashioned clothes standing silently in dark corners, the laughter died down. One night, I was in the basement archives, looking through old case files. The room had always made me uneasy, with its dim lighting and damp smell. I was flipping through a file when I heard a voice. It was faint, like someone was standing just behind me, and it said, "Help me." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice came again, louder this time, closer, "Help me." I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the room, but there was no one there. Just row after row of filing cabinets, their shadows stretching out like grasping fingers. I left in a hurry, my skin crawling, and didn't go back to the basement for weeks. The atmosphere in the station grew heavier after that, the strange occurrences more frequent. Officers reported doors slamming shut on their own, radios crackling with voices no one recognized, and the persistent feeling of being watched. Then Danny Marks disappeared. Danny was on the night shift, sitting at his desk in the bullpen, reviewing surveillance footage from a recent case. Around midnight, the power went out. The backup generators kicked in seconds later, but when the lights came back on, Danny was gone. At first, we thought he might have stepped out for a smoke, but when we checked the security footage, what we saw chilled us to the bone. The video showed Danny sitting at his desk, his face lit by the glow of his monitor. Suddenly, he looked up, his expression shifting from confusion to fear. He turned toward the hallway, as if he'd heard something. Then he stood up and walked out of frame. The next camera caught him heading down the hall toward the back wall. He stopped in front of it and just stood there, staring at the brick. And then it happened. His body jerked forward, slamming into the wall as if some invisible force had grabbed him. His hands clawed at the bricks, his mouth open in a silent scream. Then, in a flash, he was gone, swallowed by the wall itself. The footage ended with an empty hallway and an unbroken wall. We searched the entire station, top to bottom, but Danny was nowhere to be found. The wall where he vanished was solid brick, no sign of a hidden passage or loose panel. It was as if he had been erased from existence. Panic set in after that. The strange occurrences escalated. Lights flickered constantly, the whispers became louder and more distinct, and shadowy figures were spotted everywhere. The station felt alive, but not in any way that offered comfort. It felt predatory. Then the chief disappeared. He'd been working late in his office, reviewing reports on Danny's disappearance, when his door slammed shut. When officers broke it down, the office was empty. The desk was overturned, papers scattered, but there was no sign of him. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like soot, were the words, "The innocent suffered. Now it's your turn." That was the breaking point. The station was officially closed a week later, the city citing structural instability as the reason. Officers were reassigned, and the building was boarded up, left to rot like the jail it had replaced. I can't let it go, though. I still hear the whispers at night, faint and taunting, as if they followed me home. And sometimes, I see shadows move where there shouldn't be any, feel cold fingers brushing against my skin. I dream of the station, of its dark hallways and the faces of those who disappeared. Salem is a city of ghosts, its past intertwined with its present in ways most people don't understand. But I do now. Some things can't be buried, no matter how many walls you build or bricks you lay. The station wasn't haunted because of what was built there. It was haunted because of what was done there. And some spirits, no matter how long they've been silent, refuse to rest. Story number 8. The Confession. I didn't sleep the night before the call. Insomnia had become a habit lately, one of those things you just accept when you've been a cop for over a decade. San Quentin was a mile from where I lived, its floodlights cutting through the night like sentinels over the bay. I used to find their glow comforting. That was before the Holman case. The call came at 4:12 a.m., the dispatcher's voice clipped but calm, body found near the quarry. Male, early 50s. Patrol already on scene. I was out the door within minutes, my badge clipped to my belt and a thermos of coffee in my hand. The quarry wasn't far, a stretch of barren land just outside the prison walls, long abandoned after the mines dried up. It was a place people didn't go unless they had to. And from the sound of the call, Stephen Holman hadn't had much of a choice. The fog was still heavy when I got there, draping the area in a damp gray curtain. Patrol cars lined the dirt road, their lights strobing red and blue in the haze. Holman lay sprawled on the rocky ground, his body stiff and awkward like a broken marionette. His throat had been slashed, the wound clean and precise. Blood soaked into the dirt beneath him, darkening the ground like ink. "It's surgical," the coroner said when I crouched beside the body. "One cut, clean through the carotid." He didn't stand a chance. I studied the scene, the unease growing in my chest. No sign of a struggle, no footprints or drag marks. Just Holman, laid out like a sacrifice. A chill crept up my spine as I stared at his face. His eyes were open, frozen in an expression of sheer terror, as if he'd seen something far worse than death. "Did we find the weapon?" I asked. The patrol officer shook his head. "Nothing. Whoever did this didn't leave a trace. But someone had left something." A folded piece of paper was tucked into Holman's jacket pocket, stained with blood but still legible. I pulled it out carefully, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. The note was brief, scrawled in jagged handwriting. "I told you they'd come back. They always come back." Back at the station, I dug into Holman's life. He was a contractor, divorced, no kids. He lived alone, paid his taxes, and kept to himself. A quiet man in a quiet life. Nothing in his background suggested why someone would want him dead. But something about the scene wouldn't let me go. The cut to the throat, the precision, it wasn't random. It was methodical. Familiar. That's when I found the cold case file. It was buried in the archives, dusty and forgotten, Marin County Cold Case #82-197. 5 murders, all unsolved, spanning 3 years in the early 1980s. Each victim was found in isolated locations, their throats slashed with surgical precision. The media had dubbed the killer the Marin Slasher before the case went cold in 1985. As I flipped through the file, my pulse quickened. The photos of the crime scenes, they were identical to Holman's. The positioning of the bodies, the method of the kills, even the eerie lack of evidence. It was as if the killer had picked up right where they left off, 40 years later. But that was impossible. The next clue came when I reviewed the Marin Slasher case notes. Buried among the reports was a copy of a letter, handwritten and signed by Richard Mills. Mills had been a convicted killer, infamous for 3 brutal murders in Los Angeles. He was executed at San Quentin in 1986. The letter, dated just weeks before his execution, was a confession of sorts. "To whom it may concern, I can't live with this guilt anymore. The killings in Marin County were my work. I lured them to the hills, ended their lives. Their faces haunt me every night, their screams echo in my dreams. I know I'll burn for what I've done, but I needed to confess before I go." The signature was clear, Richard Mills. But there was a problem. Mills couldn't have been the Marin Slasher. 2 of the murders occurred while he was already in custody in Los Angeles. The timeline didn't fit. And yet, Mills's letter contained details about the killings that had never been made public, details only the killer could have known. I couldn't let it go. I drove out to San Quentin, hoping to find some answers. The prison loomed over the water, its gray walls casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. Inside, I met with the warden, a grizzled man who'd been there since the 70s. "Mills," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Mean bastard. Always claimed he didn't kill those folks in L.A. But he had this presence about him. Made the guards nervous." "Did he ever talk about the Marin killings?" I asked. The warden nodded slowly. "He used to write letters. Dozens of them. Said he was haunted by the people he'd killed. Thing is, he knew details he shouldn't have. Details that weren't in the papers. What happened to the letters? They're probably in the archives. But if you ask me, Mills was tuned into something dark. Like he wasn't just confessing, he was channeling. I found Mills's belongings in a dusty storage room, a Bible, a few letters, and a leather-bound notebook. The notebook was filled with ramblings, prayers for forgiveness, fragmented thoughts, and strange drawings of faces with hollow eyes. One passage stood out, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "They never left. Even in death, they whisper." I thought the darkness would take them away, but it only made them stronger. That night, the whispers started. It began as a faint murmur, barely audible over the hum of my apartment's heater. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from the walls, from the shadows, from nowhere. Words I couldn't understand, voices overlapping in a haunting symphony. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of Mills. I saw him in his cell, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow. He stared at me through the bars, his lips moving soundlessly. And then I woke, drenched in sweat, to find a single sheet of paper lying on my nightstand. It was the same jagged handwriting as the letter in Holman's pocket. They always come back. I don't know how to explain what's happening. Holman's murder, Mills's confession, the whispers, they're all connected, but the threads are impossible to untangle. Mills has been dead for decades, but somehow, he's still here. Or maybe it's not him at all. Maybe it's something worse. The whispers follow me everywhere now. I see shadows move in the corners of my vision, hear faint footsteps when I'm alone. And every time I close my eyes, I see Holman's face, his frozen expression of terror, as if he's trying to tell me something. I don't think this is over. Whatever Mills awakened, whatever darkness he was channeling, it's still out there. Still hungry. And I'm afraid I'm next. Story number 9. The Faceless Shadow. Dallas has its share of urban legends, like every big city. Stories whispered in dimly lit bars, told around campfires, or passed down in families who've lived here for generations. But most of those stories stay just that, legends. The tale of the Faceless Man had always been one of those stories, a boogeyman for the city's darker corners. That's what I thought, anyway, before I got pulled into the case. The first missing person linked to the so-called Faceless Man showed up, or rather, didn't show up, 6 months ago. A young woman named Ellie Martinez vanished after leaving a friend's apartment in the Deep Ellum neighborhood. The security footage showed her walking down the street, headphones on, when she stopped suddenly, her head tilting as if she'd heard something. She turned around, then just walked off camera. No one saw her again. Her case went cold. I didn't pick up the trail until the 4th victim disappeared. All of them had similar circumstances, late at night, alone, and the last known sighting was always from grainy security footage. No witnesses. No evidence of struggle. They were there, and then they weren't. I didn't believe in the Faceless Man at first. It was just a name people latched onto to explain what they couldn't understand. But the deeper I dug into the cases, the more the stories started to line up. And the more the fear started to creep in. The first time I saw it was 2 weeks into the investigation. I was reviewing footage from a convenience store near where one of the victims, a man named Carl Webb, had last been seen. Carl had walked into the store just before midnight, bought a pack of cigarettes and a 6-pack of beer, and left. Nothing unusual. But then I noticed something else. In the reflection of the store's glass door, just behind Carl as he walked out, there was a shadow. It was tall, thin, and featureless, more like a silhouette than a person. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or a smudge on the glass. But when I scrubbed back through the footage, frame by frame, the shadow moved. It followed him. I sat back, my hands trembling slightly. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, a weird artifact of the camera. But deep down, I knew better. The nightmare started not long after that. In my dreams, I was walking through the streets of Dallas, the city strangely silent. No cars, no people, just the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the buildings. I felt it before I saw it, a presence, cold and heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. When I turned around, it was there. A figure standing in the distance, tall and dark, its face blank like a mannequin's. It didn't move, but I knew it was watching me. Every time I woke, gasping for breath, I felt like I wasn't alone. Like the dream had followed me into the waking world. The turning point came when I found myself on camera. I was reviewing footage from another convenience store, this one near the Trinity River. The latest victim, a college student named Lisa Patel, had been last seen there. The tape showed her entering the store, buying a bottle of water, and walking out. As she stepped through the door, she glanced over her shoulder, her face tightening with fear. She started to run, and the camera caught her disappearing into the night. But then, as I fast-forwarded, something else caught my eye. I was on the tape. I'd been at that store earlier in the day, questioning the clerk. The footage showed me standing at the counter, notebook in hand, talking to the cashier. But in the reflection of the store's cooler doors behind me, there was a shadow. It stood just a few feet away, featureless and unmoving, its head tilted slightly as if it were watching me. I don't remember seeing anyone behind me. I don't remember feeling anything at all. The Faceless Man wasn't just a story. He was real. Or at least, he was something. I started piecing together the connections, digging through old records and police reports. The disappearances went back farther than anyone realized, decades, maybe even longer. Different names, different faces, but always the same pattern, people vanishing without a trace, often near reflective surfaces, and always at night. And then there were the survivors. I tracked down a woman named Maria Cortez, one of the only people who'd ever claimed to escape the faceless man. She was in her 70s now, living in a small house on the edge of the city. When I showed up at her door, she looked at me like she already knew why I was there. "You've seen him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "What is he?" Maria shook her head. "Not a man. Not a thing. He's the shadow. A hunter. Once he sees you, he doesn't stop." I leaned forward, desperate for answers. "How did you escape?" Her hands trembled as she lit a cigarette. "You don't escape." "Not really. I ran. I hid. But he's always there, watching. Waiting." I started seeing him everywhere after that. In reflections, in the corner of my eye, in the shadows that stretched too long in the setting sun. My apartment felt colder, darker, like the walls were closing in. The nightmares became more vivid, more real, until I started to dread falling asleep. The last straw came when I checked the footage from the station's security cameras. I'd been working late, poring over files at my desk. The camera showed me sitting there, the glow of my computer screen casting long shadows across the room. And then, slowly, a figure appeared behind me. It wasn't walking or moving, it just emerged from the darkness, its featureless head tilting slightly as it stood there, watching me. I turned off the tape and didn't look at it again. I don't know how to end this story, because it isn't over. The faceless man doesn't stop. He doesn't rest. He's always there, in the shadows, in the reflections, in the corners of my vision. I feel him now, as I write this, the air in the room growing colder, heavier. If you see him, don't look. Don't turn around. Don't let him in. Because once he finds you, he never lets go.